In today's lecture, we will start looking at citizen science, and in particular, we'll look at the history, trend, and look at an overview of the field as it is now. We will start by looking at some of the historical examples of citizen science to provide some context and start noticing that different flavors of citizen science are not something new. We will also briefly look at the transition that happened during the 20th century and the role of the volunteer or the amateur started diminishing, and then to see the trends that can explain the growth of citizen science today. And finally, we would look at different activities of citizen science and notice how the field has grown. To start the course, we need to look at the definition of the issues that we are covering. But instead of looking at a detailed definition, here we start with deliberately vague and generalized definitions of citizen science and crowdsourcing. We will have better definition later on as we develop the course. But for now, let's start with this. So we take citizen science as a term used to describe a wide range of activities in which people from all walks of life participate in scientific projects in a meaningful way. And crowdsourcing is a term that is used to describe finding a way to engage a very large number of people in a project. A good example of pre-modern science, citizen science, is the cherry blossom, the sakura, that is culturally significant in Japan. It started in Japan as an activity around 700, 790, and since then it's been going on and people are admiring and picnicking and doing different activities next to the cherry blossom. Now, around 8050 AD, court diarists in Kyoto started recording the happening of the cherry blossom and the date of it. And that happened also not just there, but in other places, and therefore it was possible to reconstruct it. Current reconstruction of the different dates enable us to see the changes that climate change have made to cherry blossom. So analyzing that reveal a change in climate with a shift to earlier dates by something like 2 weeks over the 1200 years where it was managed and monitored. We are talking about the phenomena that started around 1650 and continue to this very day. Modern science, we can look at it as something that had three periods in the context of citizen science. We can look at the early period between the beginning of modern science in the 1650 all the way to the mid-early 19th century. Then we can look at the 19th century, the later part, and especially most of the 20th century. And finally, we can look at the current period since the 2000s with the growth of opening science and creating new ways of doing it. In terms of relation outside science, and we need to think about it because we are talking about public engagement in science, we need to understand what was the level of literacy outside the people who were doing science. In the very early period, if we're talking about the early days of the Royal Society, in 1650 in England, only 50% of men knew how to read and write, and only 10% of women, so illiteracy was quite common. By the middle of the period, the one that we're talking about, professional science, people were more educated. It started with basic education and some schooling all the way to a level of high school education in the 1950s. But today we're talking about society that have many more people with higher education credentials, and therefore they can be involved in science in different ways. You will see that this trend is one of the trends that we'll talk later on. So going back to the very early stages of science, and we are talking about the historical context, we can look at citizen science as gentleman or gentlewoman science. In this first period, there is lack of clarity who is scientist or natural philosopher or gentleman of science, as they call them, because the term scientist was not invented yet. And in this way, all scientists were citizen scientists. But some examples do provide us a clearer definition of what was happening in the period. Example of it is the work of William Whewell, who actually coined the term scientist in 1833. And in 1835, he organized and conducted a very large project of tidal observations across the world in 650 stations where thousands of people were involved in measuring the tides every 15 minutes. Those were thousands of subordinate laborers, as he called them, who were contributing information to the scientists, who then create the task of merging this information and creating an activity, an analysis out of that. William Whewell received the medal for this work of achieving the great tidal experiment from the Royal Society. Another example of a citizen scientist from this era is provided by Mary Anning, who lived in the first part of the 19th century. She lived and worked in Lyme Regis in Dorset and was a fossil collector. She actually been a very important paleontologist and discovered several species. And she was from a poor background and therefore had to sell her fossils, and that kind of put her in a position where her work was not recognized for a long period, with people coming, mostly men, coming from London, recording, taking her observation, and then reporting on them. They were paying for her work, but they weren't mentioning her in different work. It was some other people who appreciated her contribution, and only towards the end of her life she was recognized. She was also excluded because of her gender as a woman, but also because she was from a non-conformist background, which means that she wasn't Anglican, as most of the scientists of the period. Those things influence her recognition, but we now recognize her, and her picture is appearing in the Natural History Museum in London. Another example of early stage citizen science is provided by Florence Nightingale, who is famous for her work on care and as a nurse, but she wasn't part of the academic sector that was growing already in the period. She is famous for using statistics and statistical visualization in the understanding and in the changes to the care practice. And that makes her part of this group of people who are doing science outside professional science. But she was appreciated, and she became first female member of the Royal Statistical Society. So we have here several examples of people who've been involved in citizen science in different ways. Look at what happened during the middle period when science became professionalized. As it became professional, especially during the World War, the investment in science became something that the state is doing as part of economic and military development. From the 1940s onward, we are talking about the period of big science, major projects, significant financial investment, need to use laboratories and all the rest of it and specialized tools, and that usually exclude ordinary people from participating in science. The International Geophysical Year is an example of big science as it can get. It includes many activities that were very expensive, require wide organization of many scientific societies across the world, things like rocket launching and the first unmanned satellites and ocean faring experiments and things like that. One of the important things that happened in this period is actually the fact that there was a need to monitor those new satellites with the concern over the Cold War and all the rest of it. And there was a big investment in creating monitoring stations in the United States with very heavy investment by the state. At the same time, Fred Whipple, who was in the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, was also suggesting a whole system of volunteers that will follow the distribution of these new satellites, and he created the Moonwatch project, which actually continued until 1975. When the Sputnik, the first of these artificial satellites, was launched, it was these volunteers of Moonwatch who managed to see it first, because the very expensive system was still in setup stage and was not ready yet to operate.